So thank you very much, Motomi and Dscoop, for the invitation. Actually, as a little background, 15 years ago, I was working in a printing company back in Italy, publishing the big art books, the one with the Renaissance paintings, big photographic books. So I had a very quick and terribly bad experience with that industry. Back in Italy. Then I moved from printing to writing books. It was probably more suitable for my career. And we are experiencing indeed the logistics costs that were mentioned before, because we just, at the Center for Market Education, we just published a book with an American publisher, and the price of getting the books here in Malaysia is the same as the price of the books itself. So we are unfortunately experiencing that. But now let's talk a little bit about inflation. I hope that I will not bore you too much. So we try to put it in terms as simple as possible to be understood by non-professional economists, which I think is the best way. I always tend to say, if my mom can understand it, it means I also understood and I was able to communicate. So my mom is usually my benchmark for my explanation skills. Now, so the title that we chose is just to try to clarify what we really mean when we talk about inflation. And unfortunately, also thanks to bad communication with the media and a lot of misunderstanding at policy level, there is the tendency to define inflation and price increases as the same thing. So more or less, if I mention the word inflation, you all have in mind that prices are going up. But it's not simply like that. To give you an example very much related with the recent history in Malaysia, when chicken prices went up a few months ago, that one is not inflation. So a price increase that comes from a mismatch between supply and demand, so in this case the demand ramped up much faster than the supply after the great lockdown, is not technically definable as inflation. And you may object, okay, this is a little bit like something technical for economists. For us as consumers, at the end, we just see the prices are high, and when we go to buy groceries, we just have to pay more. So it doesn't really matter if this comes from a mismatch of supply and demand or from other reasons. You can call it as you want, but for us it's just a product being more expensive. But instead, to clarify what is simply a price increase and what is instead technically inflation is very important, because the two things need to be addressed in a different way, as I will try to clarify. So not all price increases can be properly called inflation. And therefore, also when you read on the media that inflation is measured by the Consumer Price Index, CPI, let's say that is not totally appropriate. We should have a much broader perspective, or at least the will to go more in depth to understand the phenomenon. So here, I hope that I already shocked you enough to bring the Munch screen. And now I will try, as I often do with my students, to criticize what you usually read on textbooks. So sometimes things are taught and are in textbook, and they became universal truth just because they have been repeated so many times that became acceptable. So it doesn't matter if they are scientific, that doesn't matter anymore. after you have repeated for a few months that if you don't wear a mask, you get the virus and you die, then it's difficult to convince people that it's not necessary to wear a mask. So science is not always behind the narrative, including in academia and in policy decisions, even worse. So unfortunately, textbooks tend to distinguish between what is called demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. So they say that we have demand pull inflation when a price increase is determined by an excess of demand, of quantity demanded, in terms being higher, demand being higher than what the supply can provide. And this is the example that I just mentioned of the chicken production in Malaysia a few months ago. Instead, they refer to cost push inflation when the price increase is due to rising costs in production factors. But here again, we have to break the chain of this reasoning, because demand and supply keep on interacting in the market. They keep on creating adjustment in prices, and this is called adjustment in the structure of relative prices, but this is not technically called inflation. And also we have to break the mythology on cost push inflation. You as entrepreneurs, you know that obviously when the cost of your production factors increase, you will try to put that cost on the final price, you will try to recover that. But you also know that that mechanism is not that automatic, because ultimately you respond to your customers. So an increase in costs cannot be automatically shifted into the selling price. You respond to the market. Because if the market is not able to absorb that price increase, then you simply are out of the market. So you may have to look for different strategies in front of rising costs of raw materials or production function, like increasing productivity, changes in the structure of production. So the two definitions of inflation that you find on textbooks, in particular on microeconomics textbooks, demand pull and cost push inflation, are a misuse of the word inflation. A misuse that is very convenient for policymakers, because policymakers, which are often the true responsible for inflation, like obviously to accuse business people to be greedy, trade unions to protect workers, or even the consumers by increasing their demand to be the real cause of inflation. In fact, if you look at the European news, often politicians are telling that the true way that consumers have to protect from the rising prices of energy is to avoid to consume energy. They say you should not use the aircon in your house. It's you that you are causing inflation. You should not heat yourself now that the winter comes. You can be comfortable in the cold. Don't be selfish. I just back from Italy, where I was on holiday for a month after 3 years, and this is actually what politicians are telling on TV. I wonder if they turn off the aircon or the heater in their comfortable offices in Rome. But the people on the ground, in fact my parents, which are simple people, are quite desperate, and they're thinking with the winter coming, we will just go to the shopping mall, because there will be a meeting place, a heated place, and we can warm up ourselves without spending money at all. The government is asking us to do. During the summer, they have been asked to set a limit to the aircon. So again, consumers are considered responsible for inflation. So, but all these situations so mismatch of supply and demand or increase in costs at the supply side, as Milton Friedman said, this can produce high prices for individual items, which is not inflation. They cannot produce rising prices for goods in general. They can cause temporary ups and downs in the rate of inflation, but they cannot produce continuing inflation for one simple reason. None of the alleged culprits possesses, come to our topic, a printing press, on which it can turn out those pieces of paper we carry out in our pockets. None can legally authorize a bookkeeper to make entries on ledgers that are equivalent of those pieces of paper. So, none of that alleged culprits can produce inflation because none of them produce money. And as we will see in a short while, inflation is a phenomenon related with the quantity of money. So, textbooks should be purged, or at least we should, that is something that I always invite students to do, read, study the textbook, but look at them critically. They are not the gospel, they are not the revealed truth. So, what is inflation then? Is like asking your wife what's the problem. It's quite tough to get an appropriate answer. You need to do quite some guessing and look yourself, oh, what did I do wrong? Yeah? So it seems that looking for a clear definition of inflation is like asking your wife what's wrong and what did you do wrong this time again. So I will let some Nobel laureates or some top economists to speak on behalf of myself. One of them is Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in 1974 and belonged to the so-called Austrian School of Economics. He says, a general rise in prices, for instance, one brought about by a shortage of food caused by bad harvests, is not inflation, nor could we properly call inflation a general rise in prices caused by a shortage of oil and other sources of energy that led to an absolute reduction of consumption, unless this shortage had been the pretext for a further increase in the quantity of money. Inflation's original and proper meaning is an excessive increase in the quantity of money, leading in turn to an increase in prices. So inflation is a generalized increase in prices, but due to an excess of production of money, in particular to money growing at a faster rate than the output, than GDP. Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in 1976, had a very similar tune. He was the founder of so-called monetarist school. Inflation is produced by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in the quantity of goods and services available for purchase, and such an increase rises prices in terms of that money. In simple terms, too much money chasing too few goods. So inflation, and this is very important, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in the output. So this is what we can technically define inflation. The last economist that I want to quote is Armen Alkian, from the New Institutional Economics. I'm doing this overview to show that this kind of approach is shared by different schools of thought. It's not just only one. And I may even, these economists can be all considered belonging to the so-called right side, but if we go into John Maynard Keynes or new Keynesian like Axel Legenfruth that passed away a few months ago, we would find very similar definition. They mostly differ on the solution rather than on the definition. So what Alkian said? Alkian said inflation usually means a continuing general rise in most prices, not a one-time jump in most prices without a continuing rise. The difference is important. They are caused by different events. The second can be caused by any disaster, so the one-time jump, which reduces production, such as a crop failure, a drought invasion, war, plague of insects, or earthquake, or lockdowns. In these cases, with a smaller stock of goods and the same amount of money in the society, prices will rise. These events usually are transient, so they are temporary. Instead, the necessary and sufficient condition for a persisting increasing price level is that the quantity of money be increasing relatively to the stock of real goods and services. That and only that is the source of persisting inflation. So very much in line with what Friedman said. History records no instances of persisting inflation without the amount of money increasing relatively to real goods. In every case, the increase in money relative to goods occurred because the supply of money persistently increased. So, price increases are a consequence of inflation, not inflation itself. This is the first things that you can bring home. Then not all price increases are a consequence of inflation. So price increases following supply chain disruptions are not inflation. The Ukraine war does not bring inflation per se. Okay? This is very important because the identification of the proper cause of price increases allow us to eventually implement the right policy. So if we have, like we had in Malaysia with the chicken production, a mismatch in supply and demand due to the fact that after the Great Lockdown, demand raised up fast and the supply couldn't cope, what we need to do is to allow supply to step up again. That's why price ceilings are a terribly bad idea. Price ceilings put a negative incentive to supply to step up. So price ceilings keep the price high for longer time. Temporary high prices are what we need to give an incentive to supply, to produce again, to rise up, to meet demand, and eventually prices can go down again. So the policy solution that was implemented in Malaysia was going in the wrong direction. Export ban, similarly, is a bad solution because it's again a negative incentive to production. So we keep price tensions for longer and longer. So if we have this kind of mismatch between supply and demand, we need to address that to find a way to get demand and supply balance again. But instead, if we have what we have called true inflation, which should have been avoided in the first place actually, can only be cured by cutting the quantity of money. So if inflation is a price increase deriving from an excess of quantity of money, the only way that we have to cure inflation is to cut the quantity of money. The rise of the interest rate is the usual way in which this is done. But this is not enough, and it's not automatic, and it suffers of important time lags. So I'm not a strong advocate for using interest rate to address growth problem or inflation problems, because if monetary policy would be that easy, the economy is depressed, you lower the interest rate, there is inflation, you rise the interest rate, then my 7-year-old son could be the governor of the central bank, right? Or we could have just a robot, a computer, with an algorithm doing monetary policy. Instead, we have human beings that are supposed to know things better than robots. Obviously, the process of, the best way to cut quantitative money is cutting government spending, because that is what produces quantitative money. Obviously, this process is painful. So we can't, I wrote something on the New Straits Times on this, we can't get out of inflation without pain. But this inflation could have been avoided. So now, to cry on the spilled milk is a bit too late. Politicians didn't realize that this was coming, or better, they pretended they didn't see it coming. They implemented policies that created inflation, and now they are blaming someone else and to say that we have all to sacrifice ourselves and to feel the pain of inflation. But we at CNE, we had started to warn the media and the government that inflation was coming as a natural consequence of certain policies as early as May 2021. So we were there out in the media telling that this was going to happen. Nobody believed us. People say that we are the misfortune prophets. And then finally, here we are. I'm not happy to say that, but we were able to anticipate what was coming 1.5 years ago. Without modeling. I don't believe in modeling, just with reasoning. So, what was going on now? How do we explain the post-COVID-19 inflation? So, we can explain what is going on with what we just saw in the previous slide. All governments increased their expenditure significantly in order to fight the spread of the virus and support the health of their people when there was no possibility to increase revenues via taxation, obviously. So they adopted, and had to be said with very little scientific evidence, policies like lockdowns that were not backed up by science. This created a big disaster in the economy, and in order to address that disaster, they implemented expansive fiscal and monetary policy. So the quantity of money grew much faster than GDP that was indeed falling down. At the same time, also the speed of circulation of money was slowing down. But this is a bit technical, so I will not dig into it. So the immediate effect was that the demand for money was decreasing. So people were spending less. We were into a phenomenon of forced saving somehow. We couldn't go out for restaurants, we couldn't travel, etc., etc. So the demand for money decreased, but the supply increased. So you know that when the supply increased beyond the demand, the actual value of that good dropped, right? So the value of money dropped. And now this is what we are experiencing. And as I mentioned, we published an opinion article, and we published also a comprehensive paper in August last year warning about this. But not because we are particularly brilliant, but because we just saw what was happening. If instead of looking simply at consumer price index, you had start to look at the producer price index. So what was going on at the supply side level, you could have seen that price increases were starting to go up in a very important way since the mid of 2020 already. So when we started to see the situation at the beginning of 2021, the situation of price increases at the supply side was already ongoing since almost 1 year. And this is the graph that we put in our paper, and the Star published it in October. We foresaw a very fragile post-COVID growth or recovery, followed by a post-COVID crisis driven by inflation. So, in a nutshell, the current situation is a natural consequence of the expensive fiscal and monetary policies implemented to try to put a patch on harmful and useless lockdown that was implemented without a serious trade-off analysis, like instead every policy should be implemented. Blaming now the war in Ukraine is misleading, and it is just the signal of policymakers not wanting to blame themselves. We did not see it coming because we saw it coming not because we are particularly brilliant. As I mentioned, it was just enough to look at what was happening at producer prices. Here we have a demonstration with some numbers about Malaysia. Now, you can see that if we give 100 level to the values of 2019, the GDP at the end of 2021, the Malaysian GDP, was 97.33. So this means that over the 2 years of lockdown, the Malaysian GDP went down 2.7%. Cumulative, so keeping 100 the value of 2019. But what happened to the quantity of money? Here I have three monetary aggregate, M1, M2, M3. It is the base monetary base, the simplest one, and then the different level of enlargement. M1, which is the most simple quantity of money, went up to 127.78. So it means that in 2 years our GDP went down 2.7% and the quantity of money went up 28%. Inflation is this. We have inflation only because of this reason. There is no other reason. The other things are only making the situation worse. But the real cause is this. GDP minus 2.7, quantity of money 2.8. If we do, and we publish in the paper, the average for the 5 years before COVID, you will find that the rate of growth of money and the rate of growth of output were very similar. And in fact, we had always the CPI below 2%. So inflation remained under control. In these 2 years, the quantity of money grew at a much faster pace than the GDP. And this is where we are now. So you don't solve this with price ceilings on chicken. That is like, I don't know, like saying that you can cure cancer with hot water. Okay? Doesn't happen. It requires quite a lot of superstition beliefs to believe that. And in the rest of Southeast Asia, we have a situation which is not that different. This is the consumer price index for Indonesia. You can see the big jump after 2020, and at the same time, you can see the big jump in the quantity of money, M2. From 2020 to 2022, it grew at a pace that was double than what it was between 2018 and 2020. Here is Singapore, which is not doing much better. And here again, you can see the double pace of the growth of money supply in Singapore, 2020 to 2022, when compared to 2018 to 2020. So these are simple reasons why we have inflation. Now, once inflation has been fueled by the so-called full employment policies, which have been financed by the printing press, or by the monetization of debt, or by the issuing of new debt, there are only few choices available. Or we allow rapidly and accelerating inflation to continue until we have a complete disorganization and destruction of our economic system, or we keep on imposing controls on wages and prices, which, in order to be effective, force the government to grow its level of control up to the point in which the control on the economy becomes a total control, or we have to terminate the increase of the quantity of money, or at least to start to slow it down. Obviously, the first two solutions are not advisable solutions, and I hope we can all agree with that. Nobody wants to live in a tyrannical place, nobody wants to have inflation at the level of South America. I remember years ago when I was still studying in college, I had some college mates from Colombia, and they were telling me that when they were going out to drink in a pub, in a bar, or in a cafe, they were paying at the entrance. Because the price, by the time they consumed their meal, was already higher than the price when they entered the shop. So these were situations of hyperinflation that were typical in the 70s and in the 80s in Latin America. So we have to be very careful, because when inflation indeed goes out of control, the tendency, not only among politicians but also among the people, is to look for a savior the government can fix. So if someone comes that looks like an energetic politician that can actually do things, we tend to trust. And usually these things don't end up very well. This happened to Mussolini in my country around 100 years ago, with some shop guy with mustaches in Germany, also around 100 years ago, other people in South America as well. So there are people that have the ability to take control, and people tend to trust these people. Yes, he can fix it. But usually, as I try to demonstrate, politics is the problem, not the solution. So, what we have to do is to try to decelerate the rate of increase of the quantity of money. Unfortunately, we can't do that avoiding a stabilization crisis. So there will be a sort of recession, bringing in unemployment. And unemployment will come because inflation creates bad jobs. This is another topic that will deserve a different lecture. But if you give money to support industries, then industries start to hire people, not because it is economically convenient, but because of the artificial support. And these people are people that before were not earning money, now are earning money, they are spending that money, and they are pushing the growth also in other economic sectors. But then what happened when the support is withdrawn? The jobs have lost their economic meaning, and therefore all the positive spillovers also have to come down. Therefore, when you try to address artificially the problem of employment, the situation that you have when you withdraw that life support can be even worse than the situation that you had before the support. It's very sad, but it is the situation as it is. There are no magic pills, and we should probably do better policies at the very beginning, more sound policies, and usually, unfortunately, sound policies are often unpopular and therefore very difficult to be adopted by politicians when we are very close to the next elections. So, obviously, a slower rate of monetary growth will bring lower economic growth and unemployment. But Friedman used the analogy of drinking. The process is very painful at the beginning when you want to quit drinking, and it produces good effects only in the long run. Instead, getting drunk is very pleasant at the beginning and painful afterwards. Here you have a picture from a video on YouTube in which two actors play Friedrich Hayek and John Maynard Keynes, and in fact that is John Maynard Keynes in bed after having drunk his policies. So there are good reasons, however, to be skeptical about the possibility of a centrally controlled currency supporting such a process of sound control. We need the consensus, a public consensus, that the painful measures that we need to implement are necessary. If the people don't support that, it's very difficult for politicians, which are the people in charge and control of the quantity of money, to adopt their policies. And this is exactly what happened with the chicken prices. If you remember here, there was a price ceiling, Then after a few weeks, the government removed the price ceiling. Okay? We were very active in explaining why the price ceiling was wrong. Even the Newsday Times gave the front page to our argument. So the government, at a certain point, realized that, and they dropped the ceiling price. But because of pressures from the public, after 2 days, they reintroduced it. So the pressure from the voters, obviously, because voters pay the salary of politicians, were much stronger than sound economics. So as far as the people are not convinced that measures are necessary, there will be never enough power in the government to adopt the measures that are necessary. So, of course, a much more radical solution would be to completely withdraw the control of money from the government. This is a bit utopistic, but this is probably where we have to go. And one solution which I embrace is free currency. That means that, in example, to take a more something that could be at a certain level realistic, the possibility within ASEAN to choose the currency with which you make your own transactions. So you can choose any of the ASEAN currencies. This will create a virtuous process of competition among currencies. So while when the government possesses the monopoly on money, there is the incentive of devaluating the money for consensus reasons, to spend more money, etc., etc. When there is a competition among currencies, then there is the incentive to have a strong currency, because you want to use a currency which is strong. So you will not choose a bad currency if you have a better one available in the market. So this kind of competition mechanism would move us toward free currency versus instead the situation we are experiencing now, which is a competition toward cheap money, which is a money that sooner or later becomes toilet paper. Right? The next field of action is what Nobel laureate James Buchanan also advised, which is very simple and obvious. Budget constraints. Now we don't have a system of rules that force the government to spend only the resources that they have, and to get back on track as soon as that limit is overcome. Rather, we have the tendency to, by law, to increase that limit, like if that was free. We should instead introduce policy regulations that create an automatic mechanism that force policymakers to be responsible of their spending choices. They cannot spend what they don't have, which is a normal principle for us as individuals, families, and businesses, but a principle that all of a sudden seems not to be true anymore when we reason at policy level. So then there would be other topics of interest, like the link between inflation and unemployment, how to properly measure inflation, but I think we would go too far on that. Eventually, Motomi can distribute the slides. There are my contacts, so if you want to have more reading materials, if you are not bored enough yet, you can ask for more material. Here are some of the things that we have done. We have felt that because of this poor understanding, at the end of the last year, we produced an educational paper on what inflation is. We have done an educational video, which is on our YouTube channel. And then we have done policy papers on why inflation was coming and what should be done now to allow deflation to happen. Here are some of our opinion articles on inflation, and here are our contact details. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Carmelo. Anyone has any questions for Dr. Carmelo?
Hi, what is your thought about cryptocurrency?
I have mixed feelings on on cryptocurrencies. On one side, I'm quite a dinosaur, despite not being that old, but I tended to like more the old times when there was sound money backed up by gold and silver, rather than going toward futuristic solutions. But I remember I read the first article on cryptocurrencies on 2012 on the Jakarta Globe, I think. And I thought this one is very interesting thing. But then I don't have a financial mind, so I didn't invest. I look only at the theoretical part of it, and I didn't become a millionaire. But for me, rather than all so unfortunately in this moment, cryptocurrencies became just a trading tool. So people speculate, buy and sell cryptocurrencies. This is for me not what I envisioned when I read that article in 2012. What I was seeing there was the possibility to challenge the government monopoly on the issuing of money. That's what was really interesting for me on cryptocurrencies. The possibility for the people to take back the power of control over money and therefore to stop the inflationary process of government. Unfortunately, it didn't evolve in that direction, but that was what really excited me at that time. This is really a challenge toward that monopoly. A monopoly that produced more inflation than anything else. When we stopped the backup of gold, so the so-called gold standard, gold exchange standard in 1971, 15 August 1971, Nixon announced that there was no more backup for the dollar. There has been more inflation from 1971 up to today than in the previous millennia of the history of mankind. Cryptocurrencies could have challenged that. Unfortunately, it didn't go there.
Hi. Based on your current assessment, the current data, trajectory of data as well, do you think the worst is over when it comes to inflation, or we're at the peak, or the worst is yet to come?
Okay, probably the worst is over in terms of inflation, or we are close to reach the peak. In the Western world, it seems to have reached the peak already, but of course there are external factors, exogenous factors like the war in Ukraine, so this supply chain effects that can manifest on price tensions further. Where we haven't seen the worst are the economic effect, so the translation into the output, because obviously inflation will produce unemployment, will reduce the GDP because it will cut down consumption, will make it more difficult from the supply side to make investment, because let's not forget that beyond the hard facts, the economy is governed by expectations, interpretations. What inflation makes under this perspective is to make every kind of contract less reliable. And the higher is the inflation, the lower is the level of certainty and confidence. If you have a 5 years contract with a customer and you see and you expect the inflation dynamics to accelerate further, then you tend to revise that contract. You tend to have less faith in that contract. So I think that what we haven't seen yet, because we are of course recovering, so we have a positive effect from the post-lockdown recovery, is the hard effects on the real economy of inflation. And this probably will start to manifest toward the end of the year, beginning next year.
Anyone else?
Hi, I'm from Indonesia. I need to ask something. So, from your presentations, I learned 3 things. One is that sometimes during the inflations and worst case scenario, we have to cut spending. Our industry relies on promotions, which means we encourage people to actually do more spending. The other way is that is by increasing the GDP. We're here through this summit, also bring tourism into the country, so it means it increases the GDP. So can I make a conclusion that what we're doing here right now is actually help reducing the inflation?
No, actually, help to increase it. Because you are spending more money, so you are putting more money into the system, so you are creating inflation. No, but of course, I'm not saying that we should stop spending if we have the capacity. Obviously, in nominal term, probably we are spending more, but in the actual terms, we are spending less or we're spending the same. That's the problem also of measuring inflation. On the GDP also, I want to launch a little bit of a provocation, because GDP became like a religion now. Again, one of these like CPI and all these kind of things, and there is a little tendency to look beyond the GDP. The GDP goes up, down, but the GDP is made of something. It's not a totem, okay? The GDP is calculated with consumption, the difference between import and export, investment, and government spending, okay? So we sum up these things, and we get the GDP, and we see if it goes up and down. But if, in example, ceteris paribus, the GDP goes down because all the other things being equal, government spending has gone down, I would be happy. But instead, like in 2021, if you look at the components of Malaysian GDP, the only components growing were private consumption and government spending, then yes, GDP has a plus there. But it's a plus that creates a very fragile economic system because it creates inflation, government spending, creates debt, both private and public debt. So it creates costs for the future. So you have a plus there, but you don't have a sustainable model. Years ago, I was used to travel a lot to China. In the very north of China, borders with Mongolia, North Korea, in the desert. You had wonderful 10 lanes highways with no cars. When the government spent the money to build that highway, the GDP goes up. But that expenditure is a burden for the country because it doesn't generate revenues, doesn't come back, doesn't have consumers, doesn't make any economic sense. And sooner or later, the next generations will have to pay for that mistake. So let's not look at GDP as a totem. We are happy when it goes up, and we are depressed when it goes down. Look into it, look at the component. Look at investment. How are investment doing? An economy that grows only because consumption grows or government spending grows and investments are flat is a very fragile economy because it doesn't create value. Okay? And investment go more behind that. How are they financed? China has a big problem with private debt. Companies are overburdened by debt. So maybe they are investing, but they are not. They are in very fragile financial position. So there is much more beyond GDP. Okay. Otherwise, it's like looking at the person. You want to know. I want to meet Motomi. Okay. And I want to know how Motomi is. I never met her, and I need to meet her. And someone sent me like a kid drawing, with a round face, then a line, the legs, and the arms. Yes, it gives me something, but obviously it will be very difficult for me to understand who is Motomi. It will tell me that Motomi has a face, 2 arms, and 2 legs. But then I need a little bit more to understand who is Motomi. The same goes for the economy. The GDP is just that kid sketch. We need to do a little bit more homework to understand how an economy is working.
So I have a question. I'm from India. Obviously, during the pandemic, the GDP dropped and the government started printing currency or borrowing. In India, we really needed a lot of infrastructure. So, in my opinion, that was a good move because as soon as the government makes a road in India, it's utilized to a very high degree of capacity. So, in that case, probably it was the right decision. Second question that I have is that now to get out of this vicious cycle, they will obviously reduce the money supply. But if they balance it to the CPI or to the growth, then will that still cause a recession?
Okay, on the government spending, obviously depends how the money is spent. And I didn't see much investments in terms of structural infrastructures. Government spent mostly in subsidies during the pandemic, in money injections or allowing people to withdraw their funds, special help, cash handouts. So that doesn't create development. Okay, and also on infrastructural expenditures, we need to be sure if they are good for the country or not. Like in the example of China, you do a 10 lanes highway, which is something, oh wow, we need infrastructure. But do we need the 10 lanes highways in a region in which people even don't have a car? So maybe we should first make the people in the condition to have a car. Then the second is very difficult to identify mechanic effects, because the economy is very complex. It's made of the decisions of billions of individuals and the reactions to expectations, interpretation. So it's not that just we need to reduce the quantity of money of a certain amount in order to get the economy back on track. An example before, I said that we need to have the people convinced that cutting the quantity of money is good, because then if the people are convinced, they remain in a positive mood, and therefore they keep on sustaining the economy. If instead panic prevails, then we go toward even a worse effect. So the way in which policies are communicated is as important as the policy itself, because of the effects that create. So we have to try to escape the idea that there are recipes like you put 100 grams of flours, 10 milliliters of water, and etc., and some tomato sauce, and you get the pizza. It's not as simple as that. Policy making, I believe, is more an art than a science. That's why it requires a lot of humbleness.
So what would happen if you allow the inflation to go up, the GDP to grow at super fast percentage? What would happen? What is the eventual?
So you allow the GDP,
And also inflation to grow.
but allow the GDP is a very difficult. So how do you allow the GDP to grow? So it's not that you have tools that you can, either you spend money as crazy as government to get that number to go up, but then you keep on, because it's the wrong way to increase the GDP, you keep on fueling inflation, so you enter a spiral that never ends, and we find ourselves 1914 Austria, you go to buy the bread with a trolley of banknotes.
Any other questions? Anyone?
Okay.
I think let's thank Dr. Carmelo.